In this video, I'm going to introduce a few more advanced concepts, in particular context variables and slots. Let's start with context variables. Context variables are a way to store and access information during a conversation with the user. At any time, we can click on the Manage Context to see what variables have been defined. The time zone variable is automatically set for us. To reference it from our node, we simply prefix it with the $sign. Much like we can embed intent and entities in our conditions, or even inside our responses, we can do the same with context variables. For example, placing $time zone in the response of the welcome node will render the actual time zone value to the user in the prompt. Now, this isn't very useful, so let's get rid of it. Let's leverage context variables for something a little more useful. In the process, we'll also learn how to set values for these variables from within nodes. I changed the prompt so as to ask for the name of the user in the response of the welcome node. When we try it, our reply will have an irrelevant intent and will therefore execute the familiar anything else node. As usual, we need a child node to handle the response. I created that child node and gave it the name collectUsername. True as a condition, since we want to always execute this node after the welcome node is executed, and then I greet the user by their name and essentially state the prompt we used to have about the chatbot capabilities. Notice how I used the $username variable here. The name is arbitrary. I could have chosen name or user or first name if I wanted. Here we are telling the node to respond by using the value of the context variable username. But we have not set the value yet. To do so, we'll need to switch to the advanced mode by clicking on the three-circle icon and then clicking Open JSON Editor. Here we can declare that we want a username variable in our context, and we want its value to be set to input.text. This bit of code will contain the value entered by the user in input. We need the special less than question mark and question mark greater than symbols so that Watson knows that we want that piece of code to be executed and not just shown to the user as input.text. We can test this and see that it worked, which is great. We have a problem, however. What if the user doesn't want to provide their name? Consider this interaction. When asked what to call them, the user replied, "Don't call me." The chatbot then used the input text in the response, creating the somewhat hilarious response, "Hi, don't call me." We can decide to live with this. After all, the user ignored our specific request. But we can provide a better user experience by enabling the sysperson system entity. This entity has the ability to detect names in the user input. Once enabled, Watson will start training on it as usual. We can use this time to change our username context variable assignment to change it from input text to our new entity. When we test again by replying again with my name, it works like it did before. However, if we reply with "don't call me anything" or simply "don't call me," the sysperson entity doesn't have a value, and therefore the username context variable doesn't have a value either, since we use sysperson to set the context variable. So the username in the response is rendered as an empty string, and we get a less silly prompt that simply says "I." You might notice, however, that there is a space after "I," because our response makes the assumption that we have a username value. This is easy to fix by creating two responses in the node. One, where the sysperson entity is detected in the input, in which case we can use the username variable in the response, and one in which no condition is set, and therefore it's executed otherwise with a generic "I" prompt. At any time, you can check Manage Context to verify that the right variables are being set. In this case, Antonio is correctly set for the username variable. Now that we know the name of the user, we can leverage it in the greetings, goodbyes, and even thank you nodes. They say that a person's own name is the sweetest sound to them, so adding this personal touch will improve the friendliness of our chatbot and how empathetic it appears to be. This is what the goodbyes node would look like. Note that the username variable is used in one response condition and its responses, but we're not setting it in the node. Unlike sysperson, which is an entity whose lifespan is one user input, the username context variable is set once in the collect username node and can be used at any time within the conversation. The greetings and thank you nodes will work the exact same way. One response block with a username condition and using username the response, and another fallback response block with no condition and no username in the response for situations in which the variable was not set. As you can see in the Try It Out panel, this type of interaction looks a lot more personable. Now that we understand context variables, we can discuss the subject of slots. Slots are a way to easily collect information from the user and assigning the responses to context variables which can then be used anywhere in the conversation. Consider this interaction. You might recall how we have a problem here because an irrelevant reply changes our current position in the dialogue. The expected reply female in this example is interpreted as a standalone message and not as a reply to our question, and the user therefore doesn't receive the right response. This is easy to fix with slots. To create a slot for this scenario, we click on the Customize link within the Valentine's Gender question node. Here we select slots to enable them. Since slots allow us to ask for more than one follow-up question, we're also given the option to prompt for the questions all at once, rather than one at a time. We'll leave it unchecked in our case. When we click Apply, we'll see that a slot section has been added under the condition. Here we can specify that we want to check for gender entity in the input and assign the value of the gender to the gender context variable. In the third column, we specify the question we want to ask if the gender entity hasn't been specified by the user in input. In our case, we'll simply cut and paste the response that we already had. The slot will continue asking for the question until a satisfactory answer is provided. At that point, we respond based on the value of the gender context variable. We'll have 3 responses, one for each condition: gender male, gender female, gender non-binary, much like we had in the child node in the original implementation. The good news is that this node now entirely handles the Valentine's case, so we can delete the child node that we defined prior to using slots. This time, when we test and reply with an irrelevant response, the chatbot keeps us on track by asking the question again. The slot won't be satisfied until it gets an answer that contains the gender entity. Consider this scenario, however. As you can see, the user replied with something that is relevant and we know how to reply to. However, the slot is on a mission, and therefore we end up ignoring the user who sidetracked the conversation with a question about delivering information, because the slot is looking for an answer. This can work fine for irrelevant input from the user. But when the user is asking a legitimate question about delivery and we know how to answer, it comes across as rude that we don't answer that question. Thankfully, slots have a way to handle this scenario through the concept of handlers. We access them by clicking Manage Handlers, and then we create an handler for the delivery info intent. The response will be the same we defined in the delivery information node. When we test again, we see that the chatbot addresses our side question and then keeps us on track by asking the question for the missing information in the slot. And this, of course, is a much nicer experience for the end user. You'll notice that since we only have one follow-up question for Valentine's Day, we only have one slot in this node. If we had multiple follow-up questions, we would have multiple slots. Speaking of making the experience nicer, it would be good to be able to link to pages when recommending a particular bouquet. You can embed HTML within the responses, as I did in this example. The Tryout panel will not render the HTML. Instead, it will show you the response as is. Thankfully, the WordPress plugin takes care of this for us. So we can embed links in our responses by using a little bit of HTML, and the WordPress plugin will make them available as clickable links that open in a new tab. You might note that the link color for this particular WordPress theme matches the color of the chatbot, so the link is not really visible. If this happens to you, you can simply change the color of the chatbot window from the Watson Conversation plugin settings. We can go as far as embedding images and videos. For example, I added an image in the response here. When we switch over to the WordPress site and we test it out by triggering that particular response, the image is nicely rendered, embedded along with the link. Not bad. In the next video, we'll learn where the chatbot conversations with your real users are logged within Watson Conversation and how to analyze them.